There is a photograph, color, November 1963, that has been reproduced so many times it has stopped being a photograph and become something closer to a symbol. In it, a woman in a raspberry pink wool suit stands beside a man being sworn in as President of the United States. She is standing close enough to him to be touching his arm. She is not touching his arm. Her hands are at her sides. She is looking at nothing in particular, or perhaps at something very far away that the camera cannot see. Her name is Jacqueline Kennedy. She is 34 years old. Hours earlier, the man she was married to was shot twice in an open motorcade in Dallas, Texas. She tried to hold the pieces of his skull together on the way to the hospital. She has not changed her clothes. She will not change them because she wants the world to see what they have done. Those are her exact words, reported by multiple witnesses in the hours after the assassination. She wants the world to see. The world saw. It has never stopped seeing. But there are two other people in this story who are almost never mentioned when people talk about that day. They were at the White House when the phone calls came. They were too young to understand what the calls meant, but not too young to understand from the faces of the adults around them that something had been permanently broken. One of them was 5 years old, the other was 3. Their names were Caroline and John. This is their story. Not the story the world thinks it knows, the famous photographs, the salute, the eternal flame. The real story of what it meant to grow up as the children of the most closely watched grief in American history. What Jackie did to protect them and what she couldn't protect them from, and what happened to both of them in the end. To understand any of it, you have to understand the woman they came from. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born on July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York, to a family that had money and position and a talent for keeping up appearances that would serve her and burden her for the rest of her life. Her father was John Blackjack Bouvier III, a Wall Street stockbroker whose charm was matched only by his recklessness, a man who drank too much and spent too much and loved his daughters with an intensity that was probably not entirely healthy and that Jacqueline would spend decades trying to replicate in other people. Her mother was Janet Norton Lee, precise and ambitious and cold in the way that certain women of a certain generation and class were cold, not from cruelty but from discipline, from the understanding that sentiment was a luxury that the world would cheerfully use against you. Her parents divorced when Jacqueline was 11. It affected her in ways she was too intelligent not to recognize and too private to discuss publicly. She would eventually write, in an essay that circulated among her friends but was never published in her lifetime, that the experience of watching her father disappear from her daily life had taught her two things: that the people you love most are the people most capable of leaving, and that the safest position in any room is the one from which you can see all the exits. She was educated at Vassar College, spent her junior year in Paris at the University of Grenoble and the Sorbonne, the year abroad that she would later describe as the most completely happy period of her life, and then transferred to George Washington University, where she graduated in 1951. She worked for a time as a photographer and columnist for the Washington Times-Herald, producing a column called Inquiring Camera Girl, in which she asked ordinary people ordinary questions and photographed their faces while they answered. She was good at it in the way she would turn out to be good at almost everything, with an apparent effortlessness that concealed a great deal of careful attention. She met John Fitzgerald Kennedy at a dinner party in 1951. He was a congressman from Massachusetts, 33 years old, handsome in the way that certain men of Irish Catholic stock are handsome, dark-haired, square-jawed, with eyes that suggested they were privately amused by something you hadn't figured out yet. He was not faithful, not exclusively, and she probably knew this before she married him. What she knew, or came to know, was that there was something between them that was more interesting than fidelity. A shared wit, a shared love of history and literature, a shared understanding of the performance that public life required and the private self one preserved underneath it. They were married on September 12, 1953 at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island, in a ceremony attended by approximately 750 guests. The newspaper coverage was enormous. It was, by any measure, one of the more high-profile weddings of the decade. Jacqueline wore a gown of ivory silk taffeta with a portrait neckline and a bouffant skirt. She looked, by the consensus of people who were there and people who saw photographs afterward, stunning. More importantly, she looked like a woman who understood exactly what was being asked of her and had decided with full clarity to agree. The years of the marriage before Dallas were not simple. There were miscarriages. One in 1955, a stillbirth in 1956 that she hemorrhaged through alone while Jack was on a yacht in the Mediterranean and could not be reached. There were Jack's affairs, which were not secret within certain circles, and which she processed with the same discipline she brought to everything, by not processing them publicly, by maintaining the appearance of a marriage that worked while doing whatever she needed to do privately to survive one that was complicated. There were 2 children who survived: Caroline Lee Kennedy, born November 27, 1957, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., born November 25, 1960, the latter born 2 weeks after his father was elected President of the United States. She became First Lady at 31 years old. She hated parts of it and was magnificent at it. The television tour of the White House she conducted in February 1962 was watched by 80 million Americans, roughly half the country, and made her into something that had not quite existed in American public life before, a First Lady who was also a cultural figure in her own right, whose taste and intelligence were treated as newsworthy independent of her husband's politics. She restored the White House's interior with a seriousness that went beyond decoration. She brought artists and intellectuals to state dinners. Pablo Casals performed there, and André Malraux, and Igor Stravinsky. She read to the children every night. She insisted that the White House have a proper school on its grounds so that Caroline could learn alongside other children her age without the disruption of motorcades and press pools. She was building something. Whether she knew it was temporary, whether the quiet Catholic faith she maintained with such privacy had given her some premonition of what was coming, is impossible to say. What is clear is that she was paying attention to her children with an intensity that went beyond ordinary parental love. She was building them a foundation, and she seemed to understand, in some way she couldn't articulate, that the foundation would need to be strong enough to hold. It was not strong enough for what came on November 22, 1963. Nothing could have been. The sound of the gun. John Jr. was 3 years and 1 day old when his father was assassinated. He had been born, by a coincidence that would strike anyone who thinks about it as either darkly meaningful or entirely accidental, on November 25, 1960, the same day 3 years later that his father's state funeral was held. He turned 3 years old on the day of the procession, the Mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, the burial at Arlington. He turned 3 years old on the day his mother walked behind a flag-draped coffin through the streets of Washington, while the cameras of the world's press recorded every step. The salute he gave, standing outside the cathedral at his mother's direction, has become one of the most reproduced images in American history. In it, a small boy in a pale blue coat and short pants raises his right hand to his forehead as the coffin passes. He is doing something he has been told to do, in a situation he cannot comprehend, in front of an audience of hundreds of millions of people who will be watching this moment on film for the rest of the century. He is 3 years old. Caroline was 5. She understood more. In the days that followed the assassination, she was overheard asking questions that adults around her were unable to answer, asking where her daddy was, asking when he was coming back, asking why everyone was crying. Lady Bird Johnson, who moved into the White House with her husband after the transition, wrote in her diary about seeing Caroline in the hallways, wandering with a small stuffed animal, not quite lost and not quite found. It is one of the more heartbreaking images in a week that was full of them. Jackie understood something that the grief counselors and the historians and the magazine editors did not quite understand, that for her children, the public performance of grief was not the same thing as grief. The salute was a gesture made for the world. What happened afterward, in the quiet of bedrooms, in the absence of cameras, in the long years of growing up that lay ahead, that was the real thing, and she was going to manage it as best she could. What she did in the months following Dallas has been described variously as strength, as denial, as professionalism, as a kind of dissociation that looked from the outside like grace. The truth is probably that it was all of these things at once. She moved the children out of the White House and into a house in Georgetown. She received hundreds of thousands of letters from people around the world, many of them handwritten, many of them from ordinary people who had no connection to the Kennedys, but who felt in some way they couldn't entirely explain that they had lost something personal. She answered many of them personally. She wrote to Nikita Khrushchev. She wrote to Harold Macmillan. She wrote to the man who drove the presidential limousine in Dallas. She kept moving because stopping meant something she was not yet able to face. She also thought about Greece. She had visited the country with her sister Lee in 1961, sailing on a yacht through the Aegean, and had felt there something she described in her letters as a quality of light and silence that existed nowhere else. She would return to that thought for the next 5 years. The years without him. The house in Georgetown was on N Street, and it became immediately obvious that it was not going to work. The crowds outside the house were constant. Tourists came to stand on the sidewalk and stare at the windows. People rang the doorbell. Photographers were stationed in the street at all hours. Jackie had tried to give her children something like a normal life, and the world, with the best possible intentions and no respect whatsoever for her wishes, had made that impossible. She moved to New York in 1964 to a 15-room apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue, overlooking Central Park. She enrolled Caroline in the Convent of the Sacred Heart. She enrolled John in a series of schools that changed as his needs and temperament changed. He was, from the beginning, a more difficult educational project than his sister, not because he was less intelligent, but because he was less inclined to stay still, less inclined to accept the particular forms of discipline that conventional schooling required. He was energetic and social and easily bored and physically restless in ways that would follow him all his life. Jackie navigated the years between Dallas and her second marriage with a combination of genuine grief, furious protective energy, and the kind of social resourcefulness that had always been one of her greatest gifts. She made friends, old friends from before, new ones she found in New York's literary and artistic circles, people who valued her for herself rather than for her position. She had dinner with Truman Capote. She attended openings at the Met. She went to the theater. She hired a private detective to monitor photographers who she believed were getting too close to her children. The children themselves were, by most accounts, doing reasonably well in the specific way that children do reasonably well in the aftermath of catastrophic loss, which is to say, they functioned, they played, they went to school, they had friends, and underneath all of that, something was fundamentally different about them that they lacked the vocabulary to describe, and that the adults around them largely did not address directly. The assassination was present in everything and discussed in almost nothing. Jackie believed, and there is evidence she was right, that the worst thing she could do for her children was make them perform their grief for an audience. The world wanted the Kennedy children to be visibly sad. She was determined that they would be as much as possible simply children. She told them about their father. She told them carefully and honestly and in ways calibrated to their ages, not the full complexity of the man, not the affairs and the political calculations and the private compromises, but the things that were true and simple and worth knowing. That he loved them, that he was brave, that he was funny in a way that people who only saw him on television never quite understood, that he read to them at night when he could, and that he thought about them when he was in meetings, and that he would have been proud of them. Whether this was enough, whether it was the right approach, whether the absence of direct discussion of grief was a protection or a deprivation, is a question that people who have thought hard about how children process loss have argued about ever since. What is clear is that both children, in their different ways, spent a great deal of their adult lives circling back to the father they hadn't known long enough to know well. In 1968, the year John Jr. turned 8 and Caroline turned 10, their uncle Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. He had been running for president. He was shot in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel on the night he won the California primary, 3 months after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. He died the following morning. Jackie did not break down in public. What she did was make a decision she had apparently been considering for some time. She was going to leave the United States. The man from Scorpios. Aristotle's Socrates Onassis was born in 1906 in Smyrna, in what is now Turkey, and he spent the first 2 decades of his life accumulating evidence that the world was a place where the strong took what they could and the weak endured what they must. He was not physically imposing. Short, dark, with heavy glasses and a face that was interesting rather than handsome. What he had instead of looks was money, enormous amounts of it, made first in Argentine tobacco and then in shipping, and what he had instead of conventional charm was a quality harder to describe, an animal intelligence, a complete freedom from sentimentality, and an attention to the people he wanted that was total and temporarily overwhelming. He was 62 years old when he married Jacqueline Kennedy on October 20, 1968, on his private island of Scorpios in the Ionian Sea. She was 39. The wedding was attended by a small group of family and close associates and, at a distance maintained by a flotilla of press boats, by approximately 150 journalists who had sailed out to the island on various rented watercraft and were furiously photographing the ceremony through telephoto lenses. The world was scandalized. This was, in retrospect, somewhat absurd. A 39-year-old widow, 5 years after her husband's murder, was not obligated to remain in widowhood for any particular period. But the public had made Jackie Kennedy into something that public figures are periodically made into, a symbol, and symbols are not supposed to behave like human beings. They are not supposed to remarry Greek shipping magnates. They are not supposed to negotiate prenuptial agreements, which this one did extensively. They are not supposed to want things for themselves, including privacy and security and the freedom to live somewhere that the American press could not follow them quite so easily. Her children came with her. They spent significant portions of the Onassis years on Scorpios and on the Christina, Onassis's enormous yacht. Caroline was 11 when the marriage happened. John was 8. Both of them had to adapt to a man who was nothing like their father. Older, foreign, rougher-edged, with grown children of his own, Alexander and Christina, who were not particularly welcoming to their new step-siblings, and who had complicated relationships with their own father that predated and would outlast Jackie's presence. John's relationship with Onassis was better than it might have been, partly because John at 8 was genuinely charming in the way that energetic, curious boys with good social instincts can be charming, and partly because Onassis had a fondness for masculine vitality and physical adventure that John shared. They went fishing together. Onassis tried to teach him to swim the crawl with proper technique. He gave John a speedboat for his 13th birthday, a gift that delighted the boy and terrified his mother, and that was in retrospect entirely consistent with the trajectory John would spend the rest of his life following. Caroline was more distant with Onassis, not hostile exactly, but reserved in the way she had always been reserved, the way she had learned from her mother that reserve was both a protection and a form of dignity. She went to school in England for a period. She adapted. She was, even as a child, phenomenally good at adaptation, at finding the internal resources to manage external circumstances that would have undone most people. She watched everything and said less than she noticed. Jackie used the Onassis years to do something she had not been able to do since before 1963, breathe. She was not comfortable in the marriage, not entirely. Onassis was difficult and controlling in ways she had not fully anticipated, and his relationship with the opera singer Maria Callas, which had predated and would in various forms continue alongside his marriage to Jackie, was a source of humiliation she managed with her customary silence. But she was safer than she had been in America, more private, more able to be simply a woman rather than a monument. She read, she swam, she took care of her children in the way she had always taken care of them, with the fierce, slightly overbearing attentiveness of someone who knows exactly how quickly things can be taken away. Onassis died on March 15, 1975. He had been ill for some time with myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease that had worn him down in the last years of his life, with a relentlessness that seemed to Jackie, who had watched another man die before, uncomfortably familiar. He was 69 years old. His daughter Christina fought Jackie in the courts over the inheritance with a viciousness that was partly justified. Onassis had been negotiating to divorce Jackie at the time of his death, and the terms he had been considering were considerably less generous than the prenuptial agreement she had already negotiated, and partly the expression of a lifelong rivalry that had very little to do with money and everything to do with love and its discontents. Jackie eventually settled for approximately $26 million and a release from all claims on the Onassis estate. It was less than she might have gotten. She took it because she was done fighting and she wanted to go home. She went back to New York. She went back to 1040 Fifth Avenue. She got a job, the editor on Fifth Avenue. The job at Viking Press, which she started in 1975 and left in 1977 after a controversy over a book she had not personally endorsed, and the subsequent position at Doubleday, where she worked from 1978 until her death in 1994, is one of the most underrated chapters of Jackie Kennedy's life. She was not playing at publishing. She was genuinely, seriously, enthusiastically an editor, and the people who worked with her and whose books she edited said so with a consistency that is impossible to dismiss as politeness. She edited books on dance, on art, on ancient civilizations, on American Indian culture. She worked with Michael Jackson on his memoir Moonwalk. She edited Bill Moyers. She edited books that she personally found beautiful or important and pursued the projects with an intensity that surprised colleagues who expected a celebrity doing a vanity role and got instead a professional with real taste and real standards and a genuine impatience with work that fell below them. She walked to work. She walked along Central Park and up Madison Avenue, and she was photographed doing it regularly because she was still Jackie Kennedy, and the photographers had not stopped following her, but she had made her peace with that particular element of her existence in a way that allowed her to proceed with something like equanimity. She wore jeans and sunglasses. She had lunch at regular restaurants. She attended her children's events with the focused, unostentatious attention of a mother who was present rather than performing presence. She also in these years fell genuinely and quietly in love for what her friends believed was the first time in her life, with Maurice Tempelsman, a Belgian-born diamond merchant and financier who had been a business associate of her late husband's, and who was, by the consensus of everyone who knew them, exactly what she needed: intelligent, private, protective without being controlling, devoted without being suffocating. He was still married when their relationship began, and it never became a marriage. The Catholic faith Jackie maintained, even while she lived largely outside its rules, would not accommodate another marriage after the Onassis divorce, but it was, by all accounts, a relationship of genuine happiness. He was with her when she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in January 1994. He was with her when she died in May. But we are getting ahead of the story. Before we get to the endings, we need to talk about the children who were growing up through all of this, through the Onassis years and the Doubleday years and the Tempelsman years, and what was happening to them while their mother was building, with remarkable persistence, a second life. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Caroline, the one who stayed. Caroline Bouvier Kennedy was, from an early age, her mother's daughter in the ways that mattered most. Not in terms of glamour, though she had her share of it, but in terms of the fundamental character, the privacy, the discipline, the intelligence that expressed itself through careful preparation rather than improvisation, the capacity to absorb enormous amounts of difficulty without showing it on her face. She attended the Convent of the Sacred Heart on Fifth Avenue, Concord Academy in Massachusetts, and Radcliffe College, where she graduated in 1979. She then went to the Sotheby's Fine Arts program in London, partly for the education and partly, one suspects, because London was not New York, and New York in the late 1970s was still swarming with people who needed Caroline Kennedy to be a symbol rather than a person. She spent a year at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, working in the film and television office. She went to Columbia Law School and received her JD in 1988. She became a lawyer. This fact is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is both entirely predictable, given who her father was, given the Kennedy tradition of public service and civic engagement, and entirely overlooked in most of the public coverage of her life, which tended to focus on what she was wearing and who she was dating, and whether she was adequately maintaining the Kennedy legacy rather than on the considerable substance of what she was actually doing. She worked at the New York City Office of Film, Television, and Broadcasting. She co-authored 3 books on constitutional law that were taken seriously by lawyers and legal scholars. She became the president of the Kennedy Library Foundation. She raised money for public school education. She was not a figurehead doing ceremonial work. She was a person who had decided to do something real and was doing it. She married Edwin Schlossberg, an artist and museum exhibition designer, on July 19, 1986, at the Church of Our Lady of Victory in Centerville, Massachusetts. He was 12 years older than her, possessed of an intellectual energy and a genuine warmth that seems, from the outside, to have been genuinely what she needed. They have 3 children, Rose, born 1988, Tatiana, born 1990, and John, born 1993. The marriage has lasted, which is not a small thing given the forces arrayed against it, the scrutiny, the comparison with her parents, the particular pressure that comes from being required to represent something larger than yourself for your entire adult life. Those who know her describe a woman who has navigated those pressures with a steadiness that is not ease exactly, but something harder and more earned than ease. The steadiness of someone who decided early what mattered and has refused to be distracted from it. She was 41 years old when her brother died. She gave the eulogy at his memorial service and did so with a composure that those who were there described as extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure. She spoke about who he actually was, not the magazine version, not the icon, but the brother who called her for advice and played with her children and found the specific combination of their mother's intensity and their father's charm very difficult to live up to and occasionally exhausting. She quoted something Edith Hamilton wrote about the ancient Greeks, about how they were able to face the uncertainty of fate without despair because they had looked into the darkness and come back from it. It was a very Caroline thing to say. It was also, as those who knew her understood, entirely personal. After her mother died in 1994 and her brother in 1999, Caroline Kennedy became the keeper of the flame. The phrase people use, the phrase she would probably find slightly exhausting, but also the thing she is. She controls access to the Kennedy archive. She decides what gets published, what gets authorized, what version of the legacy gets curated for official purposes. She has done this with more grace than most people could manage, which is to say she has done it with the understanding that the legacy belongs in some sense to the public, and also with the understanding that the people inside the story were human beings with inner lives that do not belong to anyone but themselves. In 2013, President Obama nominated her to serve as United States Ambassador to Japan. She accepted. She served until 2017. In 2023, President Biden nominated her as Ambassador to Australia. She accepted that too. She has, by any reasonable accounting, built a life of genuine substance and genuine service. She has done it largely without complaint and almost entirely without the kind of public self-presentation that her name and her history would have entitled her to pursue. She has been, in the terms she seems to have set for herself from early on, a serious person doing serious work. She once told an interviewer that the Kennedy name felt like a hand pressing down on her chest from birth. She was not saying this as a complaint, she was saying it as a fact. The question she seemed to be answering was not whether the weight existed, but whether she had found a way to carry it without being crushed by it. The evidence of her life suggests that she has. Whether that constitutes happiness is a different question, and one she has the wisdom not to answer publicly. John, the one the world wouldn't let go. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was, by the time he reached adulthood, possibly the most famous person in the United States who had not actually done anything famous. He had been born famous, had grown up famous, had attended school and college and law school under the continuous surveillance of a press apparatus that tracked his movements with an obsessiveness that would, in a less specific context, be classified as stalking. People had been telling him since he was old enough to hear them what he was supposed to become, and the distance between what they told him and who he actually was turned out to be one of the defining tensions of his life. He attended collegiate school in New York, then Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, then Brown University, where he graduated in 1983 with a degree in American Studies. He was not a particularly distinguished student in the academic sense. He was, however, in the estimation of people who knew him well, one of the more genuinely interesting people in any room he entered, warm, funny, direct, physically beautiful in the way that photographs later confirmed, and possessed of a quality that his mother recognized as wonderful and dangerous in equal measure, a complete immunity to caution. He wanted to be an actor. This ambition caused Jackie considerable private distress, which she expressed to him in conversations that, by his own account and the accounts of people he confided in, were characterized by a directness unusual even for her. She told him that the world would never let him simply be an actor, that they would never watch John Kennedy play a character, they would only watch John Kennedy playing John Kennedy, and the humiliation of that would be profound. He disagreed with her. He was wrong, as it turned out, not because he lacked talent, but because she was right about the world. He attended New York University Law School, graduating in 1989. He failed the New York bar exam twice before passing it on his third attempt, and the press coverage of these failures was vicious in the way that press coverage of people who are famous for being famous is always vicious. The headline JFK Jr. Flunks bar exam? The hunk flunks ran in the New York Post, an example of exactly the kind of reductive contempt that Jackie had spent his entire childhood trying to shield him from. He passed on the third try and said nothing about the first two publicly. He worked as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan for 4 years. People magazine named him the sexiest man alive in 1988. He was, about this, both amused and mortified, which was the appropriate response. He had spent his entire life being treated as a physical object of public fascination, and the declaration that he was officially the most desirable object of this type in the country was, in some ways, the apotheosis of an experience that had defined and constrained him since the moment he stepped outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in 1963 and saluted a coffin. He did not, in the end, practice law. What he did instead was start a magazine. George, which launched in September 1995, was a magazine about politics as pop culture, or pop culture as politics, an idea that was either prescient about the direction American media was about to travel, or a symptom of the same forces that would eventually hollow out serious political journalism, probably both. John was the founder and editor-in-chief, and he threw himself into the work with a seriousness that surprised people who expected a celebrity vanity project and got instead a person who was genuinely excited about publishing, genuinely interested in the intersection of celebrity and democracy, and genuinely willing to do the unglamorous work that keeping a magazine running requires. The magazine struggled financially from the beginning. The advertising market for a politically focused celebrity publication was not as robust as its launch coverage had suggested it might be. John worked to keep it going with a persistence that the people around him found both admirable and, given the financial realities, slightly heartbreaking. He married Carolyn Bessette on September 21, 1996, in a secret ceremony on Cumberland Island, Georgia. The secrecy was not an accident. It was the product of a lifetime of being photographed at moments he would rather have kept private, and a deliberate attempt to have one important thing that belonged only to them. The attempt succeeded briefly. By the time the photographs emerged, there had already been weeks of speculation about what had happened and with whom. But the ceremony itself, small, dark, candlelit, in a tiny church on a barrier island, remained what they had intended it to be, private. Carolyn Kennedy was from White Plains, New York. She had worked in public relations for Calvin Klein, where she was known for an intelligence and a social acuity that matched her extraordinary physical beauty. She understood, before she married John, something of what she was walking into. She did not, in the view of people who knew her, fully understand what it would be like to live inside it. The constant surveillance, the paparazzi, the public sense of entitlement to information about her life, the way every photograph taken of her would be published with a caption that was really just a variant of "Who is this woman with our John?" She struggled. This is not a criticism. She struggled with the loss of the private life she had always had, with the transition from someone who moved through the world under her own terms to someone whose every public appearance was documented and distributed and commented upon by strangers. She and John had private difficulties that the press reported with a prurience that was not justified by anything except the public's appetite for information about people it had decided it owned. She was described as difficult, as controlling, as a woman who did not want to give John the time he should have been giving to the public. The people who actually knew her described someone smart and loving and overwhelmed, a person who had not been prepared for what she was walking into and was doing her best in conditions that were not fair. John's mother, who had spent so many years managing precisely these conditions, died in May 1994, 2 years before the wedding. Jackie did not meet Carolyn. Whether she would have liked her, whether she would have helped her daughter-in-law navigate the specific challenges of being attached to a Kennedy name, is a question that has no answer. The morning of July 16, 1999. By the summer of 1999, John was 38 years old, and George magazine was in financial difficulty serious enough that he had been in conversations with Hachette Filipaki about a potential partnership that might save it. He had been taking flying lessons for several years. He had accumulated his private pilot's certificate. He had logged a few hundred hours of flight time, which sounds like a lot until you understand that experienced pilots describe the phase between 200 and 500 hours as the most dangerous period in a pilot's development, confident enough to attempt flights that judgment should decline, not yet experienced enough to recognize what judgment is declining and why. He had also recently injured his ankle in a paragliding accident, which meant he was flying with a cast that limited his ability to operate the rudder pedals with the sensitivity the approach over water would require. The plan was to fly from Essex County Airport in New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, dropping off Carolyn's sister Lauren at the vineyard before continuing to Hyannisport for the wedding of their cousin Rory Kennedy. The weather that evening was hazy with visibility reduced over the water, and the approach to the vineyard required flying over open ocean at night without a visible horizon, conditions that experienced pilots refer to as black hole approaches, in which the absence of visual reference points makes it nearly impossible to maintain spatial orientation by sight alone. John filed no flight plan. He told no one at the airport what route he was taking or what time he expected to arrive. He declined the offer of an experienced co-pilot who was willing to fly with him. He took off at approximately 8:38 p.m. The plane entered the area of reduced visibility over the water at around 9:33 p.m. 8 minutes later, at 9:41 p.m., the radar track shows the plane entering a descending spiral. The rate of descent in the final moments was approximately 4,700 feet per minute. The plane hit the water off Gay Head, Martha's Vineyard, at high speed. None of the 3 people aboard survived. John was 38 years old, Carolyn was 33, Lauren Bissett was 34. The search for the plane and the bodies lasted 5 days. Every major news organization in the world covered it continuously. The recovery of the wreckage and of the remains of John and Carolyn and Lauren was conducted by Navy divers and took place at a depth of approximately 116 feet of water. The remains were brought to the surface and cremated. The ashes were scattered at sea from a Navy destroyer, as the family had requested. Jacqueline Kennedy was informed of her brother's disappearance through the same chain of phone calls and anxious waiting that everyone else in the family went through that Friday night. She had been calling. She had been getting no answer. By Saturday morning, she knew. By Tuesday, she knew everything. She was 41 years old. Her mother was dead. Her father was dead. Her brother was dead. Her sister-in-law and Lauren Bissett were dead. She was, by every rational measure, the last of them. What Jackie could not protect them from. Jackie Kennedy died on May 19, 1994, at her apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue, surrounded by her children and Maurice Templesman and the people who were closest to her. She was 64 years old. The cancer had been diagnosed in January and had spread more rapidly than her doctors had initially indicated it would. She had returned from the hospital to her apartment to die at home, surrounded by her books and her art and the life she had built, and she died as she had lived, with a privacy and a dignity that she had insisted upon and that those around her had finally managed just barely to preserve. She had spent the last years of her life in a state that those who knew her described as genuine contentment, the contentment of someone who had outlasted the worst of what fate had managed to throw at her and had arrived, through enormous effort and no small amount of luck, at something that resembled peace. She had her work. She had Maurice. She had Caroline's children, of whom she was besotted in the way that grandparents are besotted when the love is uncomplicated by performance. She had her friends. She had the city she had chosen as her own. What she did not have, and could not have, was any knowledge of what was coming 5 years after her death. She died believing, not naively, not without the complicated awareness of someone who had lived through Dallas and the Ambassador Hotel and the years afterward, but believing nonetheless that her children were going to be all right. Caroline was married, settled, building the serious life that had always suited her. John was difficult and reckless and brilliant, and she worried about him constantly, but he was also alive and present, and when he visited her in the hospital in those final weeks, he made her laugh in the specific way he had always made her laugh, with the irreverence he had inherited from his father and the warmth he had gotten from her. She worried about him. She had always worried about him. She had told people close to her that she feared for him, that he was dangerously impulsive, that the combination of his charm and his fearlessness and his sense of invulnerability created conditions for catastrophe that she had spent 30 years trying to manage. She was right about all of it. She just didn't know exactly what form the catastrophe would take. The NTSB investigation into the crash of John's plane concluded that the probable cause was the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. It was not a mechanical failure. It was not bad luck in the simple sense. It was the thing Jackie had been afraid of, the thing she had been unable to prevent, because preventing it would have required being alive when it happened, and also because some forms of recklessness cannot be prevented by love, however fierce, however sustained, however desperately intended. She had tried. She had tried harder than most parents try, with more resources and more intelligence and more painful clarity about what she was trying to protect against. She had moved them out of Washington, out of America, into a life that was as private as the world would allow, and then she had brought them back to New York and built them a home that was as stable as grief can accommodate. She had taught them history and art and how to behave at dinner and how to read a poem and how to be in the world as people rather than symbols. She had given them everything she had. It was not enough. It could never have been enough. You cannot protect your children from themselves. What remains? There is a photograph of Jacqueline Kennedy taken in 2013 at the ceremony marking the 50th anniversary of her father's assassination. She is standing between Barack Obama and Bill Clinton at Arlington National Cemetery. Each of them is holding one of her hands. She is looking toward the eternal flame that burns over her father's grave. She is 55 years old in this photograph. She has the same bearing she had at the age of 5, standing outside a church in Washington while the world ended around her. The bearing of someone who has decided not to let what is happening to them on the outside determine what is happening to them on the inside. She looks in this photograph like someone carrying an enormous weight with practiced ease, which is exactly what she is. The Kennedy name has been for Caroline both inheritance and obligation. The phrase she used, the hand pressing down on her chest from birth, is not metaphor. It is description. She was born into a story that was already legendary before she could walk. She grew up inside a grief that the entire world felt entitled to witness. She lost her brother in conditions of public spectacle that denied her even the ordinary privacy of mourning. She has managed all of it with a consistency of character that is, when you look at it honestly, one of the more remarkable achievements of her generation. She has not become her mother. She is a different person, with different gifts and different limitations. But she has honored what her mother built, and she has extended it into forms that are genuinely her own. The books on constitutional law, the ambassadorships, the Kennedy Library, the work on behalf of public education, these are not ornamental. They are the substance of a life that has refused at every turn to be reduced to symbol. As for John, the question of what he might have become is one that cannot be answered and should probably not be asked too loudly. The magazine was struggling, but it was also genuinely interesting. The political career that many people assumed he would eventually seek. There was serious conversation in 1999 about a potential Senate run in New York. Might have happened, might not have. He was 38 years old. He was still figuring it out. The figuring out was, from everything anyone who knew him has described, the most interesting part of him: the restlessness, the curiosity, the refusal to accept other people's definitions of what he was supposed to be. He would have been someone worth watching. He is instead someone we are left to imagine. He is frozen at 38, perpetually, in the same way his father is frozen at 46. The youth and the beauty preserved, the possibility preserved, the thing they might have become left permanently open. This is what premature death does to legacy. It removes the complication of time. It leaves only the image, bright and fixed, at the moment when it was still everything. Jackie Kennedy spent the last 30 years of her life managing the image of her husband, protecting it from the complications that time would have added had he lived. She did this well, with intelligence and judgment, and a clear eye for the difference between myth that serves some larger truth and myth that merely flatters. And then she died, and the image of her own children was handed to the same machinery, and the machinery did what it always does, reduced them to the most iconic moments, the salute and the crash, and left the full arc of two human lives largely unexamined. The full arc is more interesting. The full arc is what this was actually about. Jacqueline Kennedy, at the age of 66 as of this writing, is still working. She has been nominated and confirmed as an ambassador twice. She has 3 adult children who are beginning to live their own lives in public, and who carry the name she has spent decades trying to carry with some dignity, and who are presumably figuring out, as she once figured out, what that weight requires of them. Jackie stood at that graveside in a blood-stained pink suit and became the most iconic image of grief in American history. She was 34 years old. What she did next, the decades of work and love and protection and survival, is the harder thing to see, because it was not performed on television. It happened in apartments and offices and hospitals and on islands in the Aegean, and in the conversations she had with her children that no one else heard. She wanted the world to see what they had done. The world saw. What it has been slower to see is what she built out of it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.